Well, good morning, APUSHers. Purpose of this video is to take a look at topic 7.11, the interwar foreign policy for the United States. Specifically, we're going to look at foreign policy as it develops going out of World War I, going into the 1920s, and then how it develops as you kind of move into the middle part of the 1930s. The objective at the very top of the screen is telling us that we need to explain similarities and differences in the attitude about the nation's proper role in the world. This sounds like things that we have already discussed going into World War I and going into even the Spanish-American War. So let's see if we can find some continuity in there. Here we go. So if you remember Unit 7A, you hopefully remember that the real story of U.S. foreign policy at the beginning of the 20th century was how much intervention the United States should have with the rest of the world. Traditionally speaking, thanks to Washington's farewell address and to the Monroe Doctrine, the viewpoint was the United States should kind of keep to itself on the Western Hemisphere. But the events of World War I kind of pulled the United States, for various reasons, into a European conflict. Now that when that war ended, the United States is kind of left with more questions than answers about its future in its interaction with the rest of the world. And by rest of the world, I really do mean European powers, because this is how the United States is really identifying itself at this point in time. In the 1920s, this really does mean that the United States is going to decide to follow a unilateral foreign policy. Unilateral means like a singular direction. It's like the United States is going to be alone in its decision-making process. The reason behind this has everything to do with the fact the United States does not join the League of Nations. The sacrifice to autonomy that the United States would make in its efforts to declare war and kind of becoming permanently intertwined with European affairs. This was too much of a cost for Republican senators in Congress, so the United States just doesn't join. And so this leads to a very traditional viewpoint of U.S. foreign policy for this time period, that the United States is going to maintain a level of isolationism. And in a traditional way, like the way that I was taught this when I was a student, was the United States completely retreated back to isolationism and refused to have any contact with these other major powers in global geopolitics. But the reality is that the United States, even though there is going to be a unilateral decision-making process, the United States is still kind of sharing a vision of an international order. It's like this, almost like a personality conflict. Even though the United States didn't join the League of Nations, the League of Nations was essentially a United States idealistic kind of idea coming from Woodrow Wilson. So the United States is going to embark on this vision of international order, which is going to include a couple of different components to this. One is going to be international investment. Most directly with this in the 1920s, you see this with the development of the Dawes Plan. This plan where American investors are going to send money to the Germans, $2.5 billion in loans going to the Germans to help pay off war reparations that the Germans owed to the World War I allies. So $2.5 billion go to Germany. This money goes over to Britain and France, majority of this going to the French, and then this money that goes to the Allies is in turn going to come back to the United States as payment for the war debts, for like the loans that the United States made to the British and the French during World War I. And if you're following the flow of money, you are noticing, right, that this is American money being lent out to pay back loans that are owed to the United States. So the United States isn't really gaining anything from this, even though it kind of looks like they are. The end result is going to be kind of twofold. One, it stabilizes the German economy for a few years. From a European perspective, this looks to be very stabilizing, and the rest of the 1920s look kind of hopeful for the German economy and really for most of the European economy. But the other result on this is to put a huge strain on the banking industry, not just in the United States, but on a global scale. And so in 1929, when the Great Depression starts, and when banks start to fail in the United States in the 1930s, and they start looking for repayments of these loans, this is going to take the Great Depression and make it not just an American phenomenon, it's going to kind of show this linkage as it kind of like impacts European uh, economies as well. So it's a really strong idea at the time, but it's going to have some financial consequences. What this means for U.S. foreign policy, it's a sign that the United States is trying to be interactive with the world, keep its independent decision-making power, but trying to help out, well, a global economy based on international investment. The United States is also involved in negotiating of peace treaties during the 1920s. In the aftermath of the war in the early 20s, the United States hosts the Washington Disarmament Conference of 1921 and 22. The purpose of this is to set limits on the amount of, well, naval warships that are going to be built by the various powers that were involved in, well, the Great War in World War One. And you can see on this graph that, this really does benefit the United States and the British. And while there is definitely sort of like a huge like advantage that they are getting in terms of like the tonnage, both for battleships and for aircraft carriers, this is a little bit more balanced than what you see going into World War One. The purpose of this is to try to address the idea that, well, it was the arms race, the militarism, and the military buildup going into World War One to help cause that war. So let's kind of set a balanced playing field as we are coming out of the war. In 1929, the United States is also involved with the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. I like this. I like this treaty as like the idealistic vision that it kind of represents, because this is signed off by 62 different countries around the world, and it is basically an agreement that they are not going to, be military aggressive against any other nation in the world. This is an agreement that is designed to kind of make war impossible in the future, to try to make just the declaration of war as a war crime. I think we all know that World War II is going to be around the corner, right? So this is very idealistic and kind of foolhardy, but it's kind of important to note here that this is 1929. In the 1920s, global diplomacy seems like it is very idealistic and very hopeful and very positive, and it really is, once the Great Depression starts, that attitudes begin to shift and turn. Closer to home, the United States is going to be involved in military intervention. And when I say closer to home, I really do mean an extension of, U.S. military involvement in Central and South America. We talked about the dollar diplomacy back in 7A, the idea that American military intervention was going to be used to protect financial interests in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, as a way to protect the Panama Canal as that vital link between oceans. Well, by the 1930s, once the Great Depression is in place, the United States is going to shift that policy to what it calls the good neighbor policy. And this is promoted by President Roosevelt, and it kind of continues. Actually, it kind of starts in like the early 30s under Hoover, but the name comes from the Roosevelt administration, where the United States is going to try to be good neighbors, good stewards of peace in the Western Hemisphere, and try to be a little bit more cooperative in economic development without quite so much of the military involvement being, well, coming, well, outside of U.S. borders in those directions. This is essential going into the 1930s, because as war seems to be growing on the horizon in Europe late in the 1930s, it is important for the United States to maintain strong alliances with, well, the rest of the Western Hemisphere, because, well, there's a desire to keep the war as distant from the United States as possible. So as we transition from this, going from the 1920s to the 1930s, I think we need to take a couple of minutes and take a look at developments in geopolitics and other parts of the world. As we all know, World War II is around the corner, and while the United States is focused on its policies in the 1920s and the Great Depression in the early part of the 1930s, there is a growth of totalitarianism in other parts of the world. Totalitarianism is, I mean, if you need a definition for this, right? This is the idea of total control from the government, where there is limited free speech, free economy, free anything. Everything in the nation should be for the service of the nation, and anything against the nation, if you're acting solely in your own interests, that can be interpreted as a crime against your nation. Totalitarianism rises in four countries as we go from the 1920s to the 1930s. Going chronologically on this, Fascist Italy takes shape in 1922 when Benito Mussolini ascends to be the sole leader of the country. He is not a king, but he is a dictator. In a militaristic style government, he is leading the fascist party in Italy. Fascism, so far as a definition is concerned, is an extreme form of nationalism that's really characterized by service to the state and a really strong militaristic persona and an aggressive foreign policy to help glorify the state. Mussolini in 1922, when he ascends to the throne, one of his first steps to take is to eliminate his political enemies and then to solidify, well, the presence of the fascist party in all aspects of the Italian economy and Italian society, where there are efforts to encourage population growth, to encourage adherence to the fascist state, to encourage economic growth, to encourage adherence to the fascist state. This is everything for the state and everything by the state, is the idea with this. Mussolini, as being the first of these dictators, he is really going to become the role model that is going to be followed by, well, some other figures, like in 1925, Joseph Stalin takes over as the premier of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, after the Communist Revolution in 1917, they fought a civil war, and Vladimir Lenin, took leadership as the dictator of the country. And when Lenin died in 1924, there was a power struggle at the top of this. As Stalin wins this power struggle, he follows the same kind of tactics that Mussolini follows and begins to solidify his control by eliminating his political enemies, exiling them to Siberia, exiling them out of the country, or more simply put, just trying to have a state-sponsored murder of his political opponents. Along these lines, he is going to follow through with the idea of communist ideology and promote the idea that it's everybody working for the benefit of the state. It's important to kind of note on this that communism and fascism, Stalin's communism and fascism, will look remarkably similar, but there's a key difference here. Under Mussolini's fascism, a business could make itself really, really rich through its support of the state. But in communism, that was not supposed to happen. The only kind of enrichment should be for the state itself. I do personally believe that there was corruption within the communist state that led to personal enrichment for members of the communist central committee. But so far as Stalin is concerned, he might in fact be the most brutal of any of these dictators, and that's even knowing that we've got Adolf Hitler coming up in a couple of clicks on this. The other important detail to keep track of Stalin and the Soviet Union is because of the turn of events going through the 1930s and 40s. Stalin and the Soviets will be an ally to the United States through World War II. When you turn attention over to Eastern Asia, by the early 1930s, the government in Japan has turned more militaristic. And this is an adherence to militarism as a way to militarily compete against other industrial military powers. There's no single military dictator I would put as the figure on this. There is an emperor. Emperor Hirohito is the nominal leader of Japan, but he's a little bit more than a figurehead in the 1930s. The true leadership on this and the decisions that's going to lead Japan through their aggressive policies in the 1930s and 40s are really being headed up by a group of generals and admirals that are calling, well, making the decisions for the glorification of their country as they are racing to become the dominant nationalist force in Eastern Asia. And then last and certainly not least on this list is Adolf Hitler, who takes power in Germany in the spring of 1933, actually just a few weeks after FDR is inaugurated as president in the United States at the height of the Great Depression. Hitler's Nazi ideology is a blending of white supremacist beliefs and militaristic fascism that he kind of adopts from Mussolini's fascist persona. This Nazism and the idea of the Nazi world order is going to be characterized by a belief that Germans represent the master race, that there should be complete dominance by the German master race, and that it is their destiny to rule the Third Reich, the Third German Empire. As I talk through the rest of this unit, I am going to really kind of make a distinction between Nazism and German, because Nazism as a political belief in a political party is distinct from the German people. But in the 1930s and 40s, this is really kind of linked, these two ideas are really kind of linked very tightly together. These four totalitarian states are in the process in the 1930s of taking an aggressive foreign policy and expanding their presence on the globe. We need to take a quick look to see what this actually looks like in the early part of the 1930s.